Sandra and Greg and team. We'll take questions, but I don't want to get into the debate because we'll move into that once we've had the presentations and then we can discuss it in detail. So just questions for the board. Councillor Casey.
Two questions. The first question relates to the board's triggers. The word trigger has been mentioned a couple of times this morning. It's mentioned as one of the recommendations. Can you tell me what your trigger is for receiving more information than normal and how that trigger was arrived at?
Perhaps I can answer that. Actually, when I became the chair of this local board, the issue of triggers was not raised with me at all. I only knew about them from attending the local board chairs forum, so there doesn't seem to be a process for regularly asking local boards, especially after an election, what they want their triggers to be. So when we had the first application, 42 Pataroa Road, we just had some very general triggers. Because of the experience with the first Pataroa one, we asked to have a meeting with the consents department and we reviewed all our triggers and tightened up on them. So our triggers, I haven't brought them with me, but obviously one is any removal of Indigenous vegetation, any subdivision in the heritage area, and also any removal, demolitions of heritage or impacts on heritage sites. There may be others, but the most relevant one is obviously any Indigenous tree, which when the application for 40 Pataroa Road came along was in place.
So I think my question then is to the Chief Planning Officer about are there 21 different sets of triggers?
Well, I can't give you the exact number. We can check if you want to know what the exact number is.
I'm interested in the process by which they were arrived at, so I'll talk offline. My second question relates to training, and there's a recommendation in the report which we'll debate a bit later, which suggests training of local board members, training of resource staff, resource consent staff. Do you think if that training had taken place, the result in this case would have been different?
I'm certain it wouldn't have. I'm not an RMA expert, but I've practiced law for 30 years, and the extra training wouldn't have changed my performance or behaviour to the application. The need is for, the one urgent need that we do have is for assistance in processing these applications. Now we would get maybe 8 a week, and there's 4 or 5 inches worth of paper, and it's written in planning talk, so it's quite a specialised language. So the one bit of assistance that we could receive is to help to process and understand those applications.
Good. Other questions? Councillor Wood.
Yeah, just going back to page 63, this is the advice you get in relation to weekly resource consent applications. Is there more to the report than that, though? Does it give you the addresses of the location, how do you locate these addresses?
Yes, if the one
yeah.
I've passed around will show that.
Yeah.
So yes, it does. I think they've taken out the addresses out of there. I don't, for some reason.
Because the port. I remember the one on the port. Those extensions of the wharves. They did have. I think it was a bit more to kind of give the address. I mean, so you have to advise what you're interested in, do you? As far as these, or do you get the whole lot for your particular area?
So we've got 2 things happening. One is a schedule such as I've tabled and is being sent round, gets sent to all local boards once a week. And that schedule covers all applications for the whole region and also any notified, which tend to be smaller number. You'll see in that one there's about 5. So we get that. But having set the triggers, then the consent staff have a process which I'm not aware of the detail, which enables them to pick up. So if we've said one of our trigger points is any Indigenous native vegetation, then they've got a process by which they're able to identify any of those in our local board area, and they come to us with the complete application.
Okay, so because you haven't got, because you didn't have the right triggers, is that why you missed out on these ones?
We did have the triggers in place by the time of the second one, as I said. Yeah. Because we missed the first one, and then it was brought to our attention by members of the community, and then we picked it up and had quite a lot of communication with the consents department. But with them, that was when we had the meeting with the consent staff and set the triggers. And we said we'd give it 6 months because we realised we'd actually set quite a lot of triggers and see whether we were flooded.
So is that done locally? Is that a centralised processing activity?
Mr. Kimpton might be able to just tell you
I think
a bit
we
more.
might. So, Councillor, I think we've got a presentation from Roger Blakely and a presentation from Dean Kimpton about the process. So I think if we're talking about our processes, probably save that for here.
Yeah.
We just want to clarify the key issues for the Waitakere Rangers local board.
Okay.
So I think
So, but
we
just to
might
let
be.
the councillor Wood know, there's these 2 parallel processes go on. So we've got whole applications coming to us according to the trigger points from the consent staff, and we get the schedule of every application in the Auckland region.
Okay, so you go, if you want to follow it up, you go to locally, or do you have to go back to the central?
We send an email to somebody, and I'm not sure where they are, and say we'd like to look at this one, and then they will then send the information on any of the additional ones.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Walker.
Sure. I understand this issue about triggers and so on. Given that we're dealing with trees that are in a protected area, SEAs, the Waitakere Rangers heritage area, quite obviously we're looking at resource consents. Would it be helpful for the local board if the accumulation of trees being removed was in a specific database with a subset of that for the Waitakere Rangers, so that you would have a better trigger, but also so there was some recording of the cumulative effect? Because we know that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has identified the death by 1,000 cuts.
Yep.
Would that be helpful? And do you have any suggestions as to how that might happen?
I can answer this one actually. That's a good question, and goes back to the suggestion that we had of having a little bit more help around dealing with this. Particularly if we had someone dedicated or some part-time dedicated around helping us to process this, because like you said, once we establish some triggers, we're going to be potentially looking at a lot of the stuff for those very reasons. We could be actually compiling that information ourselves, because it's particularly an issue for our local board, because we're dealing with something which is covered under a Heritage Area Act, and yet we don't have any blanket tree coverage.
Having said that, this is not just a matter for the local board, it's the matter for the council, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's correct, because it's Auckland Council's statutory duty to maintain the Heritage Area Act and monitor it, so this could be actually incorporated as part of the monitoring for that.
Okay, so I just signalled that as something that we need to look into, Madam Chair.
Can I just add to that, and I suggested this to Mr. Blakely, that actually the consents department could do a bit of a report on which local boards are doing the most of this kind of work, because in talking to the chairs at the local boards forum, I get the impression that there are particular boards that do a lot of this or have a need to do a lot of this, and there are other local boards that don't. So it would be worth looking at, you know, over a 6-month period, for instance, which of the local boards looked at a lot of resource consents, because then we'd be very keen to see some resource directed at those local boards to assist in carrying out that particular role.
Let's pick that up. We'll pick that up in the item, Sandra. Okay, I think we've... Oh, Member Taipere?
Madam Chair, me nui kia koutou I tēnei wā. This review comes from the trigger of Paturoa Road applications, and I understand it's about the future, and in terms of the review, I'm hearing you say that there are matters in that review that you refute, to use my own language. So that's, and you've offered suggestions in terms of the way forward for the future. But my niggling concern is, what's your position on the current trigger of Paturoa Road that initiated the review, and what is your expectation that was going to happen with that application, seemingly that the review says it's okay? So I'm keen to know from the board's perspective, is there any position that you take to address that application any further in that consent? Because it seems like it's been put to the side, yet it's the catalyst for the review, and I'm quite keen to know what the board is going to do about that, or thinks it can do about that, if it's going to do anything at all.
When you look at the report, what the report says is that the decision that was made was open to the person making the decision, and there wasn't anything that stood out as an error during that process. But the flip side of that is also that it was open to the person making the decision to make a different decision. That different decision wasn't made. So the council's made it, and we expressed the community preference, which is the community preference was clearly to keep the trees. So clearly the Consents Department is not in step with community preferences around saving mature, native, indigenous forest. We're in a situation at the moment where the owner has said that he will not fell the trees, and I understand there's some sort of process going on which Mr Blakely might want to elaborate on to negotiate with the owner about an outcome. Would anybody else like to add anything in terms of what else we could do at this stage? I don't know that there is.
I think that's a good summary, actually, Sandra. I think there's a process underway between an independent mediator and the owner. But the discussion today is about the review of the process and what would be changed in the process to pick up the concerns raised. It's not a review of the consent. That's a subtle but important difference.
Sure, but the review has highlighted that, in what I could read, there were some changes being proposed, but the review, in my view, has highlighted that it was an appropriate process that it undertook.
So I'd like us to,
Well,
I know Saffron wants to speak, but we need to be really cognizant of the difference between the two. So I'd like to pick it up.
Madam Chair.
And you are, and I'd like to pick it up. We've got the presentation from Dr Blakely and the presentation from Dean Kilton.
But it's the board I'm talking to. I will be definitely getting into the report, but I really need to understand what the board's saying. That's all. But I'm happy to hear more.
So Saffron? Okay.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I'm new in this role and in this organisation, but I'm clear that the feeling of this board is that the decision was wrong, the process was wrong, and I think one of the best pieces of evidence was raised by you, Mr Taipere, in the last meeting when you asked specifically about the report to iwi and what that specified in terms of asking for iwi consent for the clearance, and in what was specified was clearance of some native vegetation. So it's my belief that that letter was misleading, and therefore that information to do that led to the person making the decisions or the people making the decisions was actually inaccurate, and therefore the decision was wrong.
Thank you.
And
Can I just add that we don't understand why our communications to the Consents Department weren't put in front of the principal planner or weren't put in front of the person making the decision. You know, I've drawn your attention, Mr Blakely, to the numerous emails that we were sending to the manager of the Consents Department that somehow didn't make, and we were objecting to the process, we were arguing for notification, etc., and saying that the community wanted to save the trees, but somehow that did not get moved on in the Consents Department to the right person.
We'll pick it up when we'll pick it up in your part of the report.
Sorry, one last little thing, if that's okay. Just wanting to reiterate the point raised by Sandra earlier that an ecologist actually recommended that Auckland Council buys this particular piece of land, and somehow that doesn't quite fit in with the effects on the trees there being less than, to not warrant notification. So it just seems that even within that process, there's just huge contradictions there. You've got a council ecologist who's recommending something, but it doesn't even seem to be noticed.
Respond to that.
Thanks.
Or do you... I'm just a little bit, yeah. So we're getting into the detail now. I think we've probably, thank you, board. I think we've probably gone as far as we can go. I think it is time that we start to get some of those questions answered. So thank you for the
Madam Chair and
clear
committee.
presentation.
Yeah,
Thank you.